For 13 years, the locked doors of a minister's home held a secret no one could unlock. April 1989, Lakeville, Indiana. A family of 4, a pastor, his wife, 2 young daughters, found dead the morning after prom night. No forced entry, no weapon, no witnesses, just silence and a house that knew too much. The town prayed for answers that never came. Evidence rooms collected dust. Memories faded into rumor. Then, in the quiet of a new millennium, a detective opened the file again. What he found wasn't hidden in fingerprints or bloodstains. It was buried in time itself, in the narrow window between an argument and a dance, between discipline and desperation. When the arrest came, it didn't bring peace. It brought a question that still haunts Lakeville. Can justice exist without proof, or does certainty demand more than belief? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning sun broke gently over Lakeville, Indiana, on Saturday, April 29, 1989. Spring had arrived with the promise of renewal, painting the small town in pastel warmth. Inside the modest parsonage on Jefferson Street, Reverend Bob Pelley sat at the kitchen table, his reading glasses perched low on his nose as he reviewed sermon notes. The scent of coffee mingled with the sound of Dawn humming softly at the stove, flipping pancakes for the children. Bob was a man of structure. His congregation at the Olive Branch Church of the Brethren knew him as principled, devoted, and unyielding in his faith. At home, those same qualities translated into strict boundaries. Rules were not suggestions, curfews were not negotiable, and on this particular morning, the topic of prom had already been discussed too many times. Jeff appeared in the doorway, still in his pajama pants and an old t-shirt. He was 17, lean and restless, caught between adolescence and adulthood. His hair was slightly too long for the father's taste, and his eyes carried a quiet defiance that had been growing for months. "Dad, can we talk about tonight?" Jeff's voice was calm, measured. He had learned not to provoke too quickly. Bob looked up from his notes, his expression already set. "We've been over this, Jesse." Jeff hated being called Jesse at home. It felt like a leash, a reminder that he was still his father's son before he was his own person. "I know, but everyone's going. It's prom. It's not just a dance. It's a social event that requires responsibility," Bob interrupted, setting his pen down with deliberate care. "And you've shown me lately that responsibility isn't your priority." Dawn glanced over her shoulder, her face soft with concern. She had always been the mediator, the one who tried to smooth the edges between father and son. "Bob, maybe we can..." "Dawn, please." Bob's tone wasn't harsh, but it was final. Jeff's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to push back, to make his father see him as more than a rule to be enforced, but he swallowed the words. "I'll be responsible. I promise." Bob studied his son for a long moment, then he nodded, but the conditions came swiftly. "You may go, but you'll be home by midnight, no exceptions, and you'll check in with your mother before you leave." Jeff exhaled, relief flickering briefly across his face. "Okay, thank you." Bob returned to his notes. The conversation effectively over. Dawn offered Jeff a small, encouraging smile as she plated the pancakes. In the living room, Janel and Jolene giggled over a cartoon on the television, their innocence untouched by the tension that had just unfolded. Later, members of the congregation would recall that morning. They described the Pelley home as strict but loving, a place where faith and family intertwined tightly. Some said Bob's discipline came from devotion. Others whispered that it came from fear that the world would corrupt his children if he didn't hold the line. Jeff's friends remembered something else. They remembered his frustration, the way he would vent quietly about feeling suffocated. One friend would later tell investigators that Jeff had seemed unusually quiet in the days leading up to prom, as though something weighed on him that he couldn't quite name. But on that Saturday morning, none of it seemed unusual. Families argued, teenagers pushed boundaries, fathers held firm. It was ordinary, it was normal. It was the last normal day the Pelley family would ever have. By afternoon, the house had shifted into a different rhythm. Jeff moved through his room with careful precision, pulling his rented tuxedo from its hanger and laying it across his bed. The black fabric seemed too formal, too adult. He stared at it for a moment, then began to dress. Downstairs, Dawn prepared an early dinner. Bob had retreated to his study to finalize his Sunday sermon. The girls played in the backyard, their laughter drifting through the open windows like a melody. Jeff descended the stairs just before 5 o'clock, his tie slightly crooked. Dawn appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. Her eyes softened when she saw him. "You look handsome," she said quietly. Jeff managed a small smile. "Thanks." She reached up to adjust his tie, her touch gentle. "Your father loves you, you know. He wants what's best for you." Jeff didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to say. Love and control had always felt tangled together in this house, impossible to separate. Bob emerged from the study, his expression neutral. "Remember, midnight." "I know." And Jesse? Bob paused, his gaze steady. Make good choices tonight, Jeff nodded. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. A friend arrived to pick Jeff up. Witnesses would later recall seeing Jeff leave the house around 5:30 p.m. He seemed tense, they said, quieter than usual. One friend mentioned that Jeff had paced near the car for a moment before getting in, as though he had forgotten something or was debating whether to go back inside, but he didn't go back. He climbed into the passenger seat, and the car pulled away from the curb. Behind him, the Pelley home stood quiet in the fading light. Inside, Dawn finished preparing dinner. Bob returned to his sermon. The girls chased each other through the hallway, their voices bright and carefree. The house was full of life. In a few hours, it would be full of silence. Small-town gossip moved slowly in Lakeville, but it moved. By the time Jeff arrived at LaVille High School, whispers had already begun circulating. The pastor's boy is at odds with his dad again. Did you hear they almost didn't let him come? The rumors were harmless, the kind of talk that evaporated by Monday morning. But later, those whispers would be resurrected, examined, and transformed into something far darker. LaVille High School's gymnasium had been transformed. Streamers hung from the rafters in spirals of blue and silver. A DJ stood in the corner, spinning pop hits that reverberated off the walls. Laughter echoed. Camera flashes popped. The air smelled of cheap cologne and hairspray. Jeff arrived just after 6 o'clock. Classmates greeted him with smiles and teasing remarks about his tie. He moved through the crowd with a practiced ease, blending in but never quite settling. He danced for a while, posed for a few photos, and made conversation that felt more automatic than genuine. But then, around 7:30, he disappeared. Several students noticed his absence. One girl, a mutual friend, later told investigators that she had looked for him to take a group photo, but he was nowhere to be found. Another classmate recalled checking the parking lot and not seeing him there either. Jeff reappeared roughly an hour later, just before 9. When asked where he had been, he offered a vague explanation about stepping outside for air. No one thought much of it at the time. Teenagers wandered, proms were chaotic, was easy to lose track of people. But in the years that followed, that hour would become the most scrutinized 60 minutes of Jeff Pelley's life. Investigators would later reconstruct his timeline with obsessive precision. They would measure distances, calculate drive times, and chart every possible route between the high school and the Pelley home. They would conclude that Jeff had just enough time, barely, but enough to leave the prom, drive home, commit the murders, clean up, and return to the dance. The prom photos would become courtroom exhibits. Jeff's tuxedo would be analyzed for blood spatter that was never found. His calm demeanor that night would be reframed as chilling rather than normal. But on April 29, 1989, none of that had happened yet. Jeff was just a teenager at a dance, counting down the hours until midnight. Around him, his classmates celebrated. The music played, the lights dimmed for slow songs, and 10 miles away, in a locked house on Jefferson Street, 4 people were dying. Sunday morning, April 30, arrived with a stillness that felt wrong. The Pelley family was always early to church. Bob believed punctuality reflected devotion, and Dawn ensured the children were ready well before service began. But on this morning, the pews at Olive Branch Church of the Brethren remained empty of the pastor's family. At first, the congregation assumed a delay. Perhaps one of the girls had been sick. Perhaps Dawn was managing a last-minute crisis. But as the minutes ticked past and the service start time came and went, concern began to ripple through the gathering. 2 church elders drove to the Pelley home. They knocked. No answer. They called out. Silence. One peered through a front window and saw nothing unusual, no signs of struggle, no indication of distress, but the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that carries weight. They called the police. Officers arrived within minutes, and when no response came, they forced entry through the front door. What they found would haunt Lakeville for decades. Bob Pelley lay in the hallway, his body still. Dawn was nearby, her life taken in the same brutal efficiency. In separate rooms, Janel and Jolene were discovered, their small forms motionless. All 4 had been shot. The house was locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no scattered belongings suggesting robbery. Just 4 lives, ended in silence. The officers radioed for backup, their voices tight with shock. Within the hour, Jefferson Street was sealed off. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the spring breeze. Neighbors gathered on their porches, whispering to each other in disbelief. News traveled fast in a town like Lakeville. By noon, everyone knew. The pastor and his family were dead. The local paper would run the headline the next day, "Pastor's Family Slain, Community in Shock." Inside the house, detectives began their grim work. They photographed every angle, cataloged every detail, and searched for the one piece of evidence that would explain the inexplicable. But the scene offered more questions than answers. The family shotgun was missing. There were no fingerprints on the door handles, no blood trails leading outside. Whoever had done this had either been extraordinarily careful or extraordinarily lucky, or they had known the house well enough not to leave a trace. The forensic team worked through the afternoon and into the evening. Detectives moved methodically, lifting prints from surfaces, swabbing for gunpowder residue, and mapping the positions of each victim. The house felt frozen, as though time had stopped the moment the first shot was fired. One detective knelt in the hallway, studying the pattern of blood spatter on the wall. Another examined the lock on the front door, confirming what they already suspected: it had been engaged from the inside. That single detail eliminated the possibility of a random intruder. Whoever killed the Pelleys had either been let in willingly or had a key. The missing shotgun became the investigation's first major lead. It was a family weapon, kept in Bob's study for protection. Its absence suggested premeditation, not impulse. Someone had taken it deliberately, used it, and removed it from the scene. But where was it now, and who had taken it? Detectives began interviewing neighbors. Most had heard nothing unusual the night before. One woman recalled hearing what might have been a car door closing around 8 o'clock, but she couldn't be certain. Another neighbor mentioned seeing Jeff leave for prom earlier in the evening, but hadn't noticed him return. The congregation gathered outside the police tape, their faces pale with grief. Some prayed, others wept openly. Bob Pelley had been their spiritual leader, the man who guided them through births, deaths, and everything in between. Dawn had organized the church potlucks. The girls had sung in the children's choir. Losing them felt like losing the heart of the community itself. One church elder spoke to a reporter, his voice breaking. This was a family of faith. Who could do this to them? Who could take them from us? The question echoed through Lakeville, unanswered. Inside the police station, the lead detective sat at his desk, reviewing the initial findings. No forced entry, no robbery, no witnesses. The locked house suggested intimacy, someone the family knew, someone they trusted. But the brutality suggested rage, a deep and personal fury. He circled one name in his notes: Jeff Pelley. The son had been at prom. Multiple witnesses confirmed it. But that unaccounted-for hour nagged at the detective. Where had Jeff gone, and why had he been so vague about it? For now, there wasn't enough to bring him in. Just suspicion, just a hunch. The detective closed the file and stared out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, a killer was walking, free, and the clock was already ticking. The funeral was held on a Thursday afternoon, 5 days after the murders. The church overflowed with mourners. People stood in the back, lined the aisles, and gathered outside in the parking lot. The entire town seemed to have come to say goodbye. 4 caskets sat at the front of the sanctuary: Bob's, Dawn's, Janel's, Jolene's. Flowers surrounded them in waves of white and pink. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and grief. Jeff sat in the front row, flanked by relatives. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. Some in the congregation watched him with sympathy, seeing a young man shattered by loss. Others watched him with something else, a quiet, growing suspicion. Why wasn't he crying? The question would be asked later, whispered in kitchens and church basements. People remembered how Jeff had stood apart during the viewing, his hands clasped in front of him, his gaze distant. They remembered how he had accepted condolences with polite nods but offered little emotion in return. To some, it looked like shock. To others, it looked like guilt. The pastor who led the service spoke of faith tested by tragedy, of a family taken too soon, of trust in God's plan even when it made no sense. His words were meant to comfort, but they landed heavily. How could there be a plan in this? How could a father, a mother, and 2 innocent children be part of any divine design? After the service, the congregation filed past the caskets one last time. Jeff stood at the end, shaking hands, accepting embraces. A few people lingered, wanting to say something meaningful, but finding no words sufficient. One church member, an older woman who had known Bob for years, pulled Jeff aside. "I'm praying for you, Jesse. I'm praying for the truth to come out." Jeff looked at her, his eyes flat. "Thank you." She walked away unsettled, though she couldn't say why. Outside, detectives stood at a distance, watching. They had learned long ago that funerals often revealed more than evidence. Guilt had a way of surfacing in grief, of showing itself in small, telling gestures. They watched Jeff climb into a car with family members. They watched the mourners disperse. They watched the church empty, leaving only the echo of unanswered prayers. Back at the station, the lead detective added a note to the growing file: suspect behavior, observed at funeral detachment, lack of visible emotion, requires further investigation. But investigation required evidence, and evidence remained maddeningly absent. The case was marked inactive within weeks. The file was placed in storage, joining the rows of other unsolved homicides that lined the evidence room shelves. Detectives moved on to newer crimes, fresher leads. Lakeville tried to heal, but the wounds remained open, and the questions never stopped. The 1990s passed slowly for Lakeville. The town rebuilt its routines, though the shadow of the Pelley murders never fully lifted. The parsonage on Jefferson Street stood empty for years, its windows dark, its rooms untouched. No one wanted to live in a house where 4 people had died. Children grew up hearing the story as a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil could exist even in the safest places. Jeff Pelley became a ghost in local memory, the son who had lost his family, the teenager whose name was whispered with equal parts pity and doubt. Jeff himself moved away, trying to build a life beyond the tragedy. He attended college, found work, and avoided Lakeville whenever possible. The weight of suspicion followed him, but without charges, he remained free. Jessie Pelley, the surviving sister, grew up in the care of relatives. She had been only 9 years old the night her family was killed, staying with friends during the prom. For years, she struggled to remember details. Therapists encouraged her not to force the memories, to let them surface naturally. But as Jessie matured, fragments began to return. She remembered the arguments between her father and Jeff. She remembered the tension that had filled the house in the weeks before the murders. She remembered being afraid, though she couldn't articulate why. In quiet moments, Jessie prayed for clarity. She prayed for justice. And she prayed for peace, even though she wasn't sure what that would look like. Meanwhile, the case file gathered dust in the evidence room. Detectives occasionally pulled it out, reviewed the notes, and set it back on the shelf. There was nothing new to pursue. The missing shotgun had never been found. No witnesses had come forward. The timeline remained circumstantial at best. The Pelley murders seemed destined to remain one of Indiana's enduring mysteries, a tragedy without resolution, a wound that would never fully heal. But in 2002, something changed. A new detective, assigned to review cold cases as part of a departmental initiative, opened the Pelley file. He read through the reports with fresh eyes, unencumbered by the frustration of the original investigators. He reconstructed the timeline, mapped the distances, and calculated the possibilities. And he came to a conclusion that the original detectives had suspected but never proven. Jeff Pelley was the only person who could have committed the murders. The detective brought his findings to the prosecutor's office. They reviewed the evidence together: the prom timeline, the locked house, the missing shotgun, the lack of forced entry. None of it was definitive. All of it was suggestive. The prosecutor made the decision. 13 years after the murders, they would charge Jeff Pelley. Lakeville woke to the news on a cold morning in late 2002. The headlines screamed what many had suspected for over a decade: pastor's son, arrested for family murders. The case that had gone cold was suddenly burning again. The charging documents were filed in St. Joseph County Superior Court, 4 counts of murder. Each one carried the weight of a life taken, a family destroyed. Jeff Pelley, now 30 years old, was arrested at his home. Neighbors watched as police led him away in handcuffs, his face calm, but his eyes betraying the shock of a man who had believed the past was finally behind him. The prosecutor held a press conference that afternoon. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, cameras rolling, microphones extended. The prosecutor stood at the podium, composed and confident. After 13 years of investigation, the prosecutor began, "We believe we have sufficient evidence to bring justice to the Pelley family. This case is built on a foundation of circumstantial evidence, motive, opportunity, and timeline. We believe Jeff Pelley murdered his father, stepmother, and 2 half-sisters on the night of April 29, 1989, and then attended his high school prom as though nothing had happened." The words hung in the air, stark and accusatory. Reporters shouted questions. "What physical evidence do you have? Is there a confession? How can you prove this after so many years?" The prosecutor raised a hand for silence. "We are confident in our case. The details will be presented in court. For now, we ask the community to trust the process and allow justice to move forward." The defense attorney, assigned to represent Jeff, issued a statement later that day. His tone was measured, but firm. "This is a case built on speculation, not evidence. There is no physical proof linking Jeff Pelley to these crimes. No weapon, no fingerprints, no DNA. We will vigorously defend him against these charges, and we believe the truth will prevail." Lakeville, once again, was divided. Some residents felt relief. Finally, after all these years, someone was being held accountable. The pastor's family would have justice. The case would have closure. Others felt uneasy. How could someone be charged with murder based on circumstantial evidence alone? What if the prosecutor was wrong? What if Jeff Pelley was innocent? The local news broadcasts ran special segments: Cold Case Breakthrough and Justice Delayed, Not Denied. Interviews with former church members aired nightly. Some spoke of Bob Pelley's devotion. Others spoke of the tension they had sensed between father and son. Jessie Pelley, now an adult, released a brief statement through her attorney. "I support the investigation and trust that the legal system will reveal the truth. My family deserves justice." Inside the county jail, Jeff sat in a cell, processing the reality of his situation. 13 years. He had lived 13 years, believing the nightmare was over, that he could finally move forward. Now, it was starting all over again. And this time, the stakes were life in prison. Jury selection began in early 2006. The courtroom in St. Joseph County was packed daily, filled with spectators, journalists, and family members. The trial had become a media sensation, drawing attention from across Indiana and beyond. Selecting an impartial jury proved difficult. Nearly everyone in the region had heard of the Pelley murders. The case had become part of local lore, a story told and retold until the details blurred into myth. The judge, a veteran of high-profile cases, conducted the selection process with careful deliberation. Potential jurors were questioned extensively about their knowledge of the case, their views on circumstantial evidence, and their ability to remain objective. After 2 weeks, a jury of 12 was seated. They ranged in age from mid-20s to late 60s. Some had children of their own, others had never married. They came from different towns, different backgrounds, different beliefs, but they all shared one responsibility: to determine whether Jeff Pelley had murdered his family. The defense attorney moved to exclude certain testimonies, arguing that without physical evidence, the case relied too heavily on speculation and emotion. The judge denied most of the motions, ruling that the circumstantial nature of the evidence did not make it inadmissible. That decision would shape everything that followed. On the morning of the trial's first day, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Jeff sat at the defense table, dressed in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. His attorney sat beside him, reviewing notes. Across the aisle, the prosecutor organized exhibits, photographs, timelines, witness statements. The families of the victims filled the front rows. Jessie Pelley sat among them, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on her brother. Their eyes met briefly, then both looked away. The judge entered, and the room rose. "Please be seated," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "We are here in the matter of the state of Indiana versus Jeff Pelley. Is the prosecution ready?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Is the defense ready?" "Yes, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Very well. The prosecution may deliver its opening statement." The prosecutor rose, buttoned his jacket, and approached the jury. He paused for a moment, letting the silence settle. Then he began. April 29, 1989. A father tells his son he can attend prom but sets conditions, boundaries meant to teach responsibility. The son, 17 years old, feels suffocated. He wants freedom. He wants to break away. And so, on the night that should have been filled with music and laughter, he makes a choice that destroys his family, a choice that leaves 4 people dead. The prosecutor's voice was steady, almost conversational, but every word carried weight. "We will show you that Jeff Pelley had the motive, the opportunity, and the means to commit these murders. We will show you that he left prom for an unaccounted hour, just enough time to drive home, kill his family, and return to the dance. We will show you that no one else could have done this. And we will ask you, at the end of this trial, to deliver justice for Bob, Dawn, Janel, and Jolene Pelley." He returned to his seat. The jury sat in silence, absorbing the narrative they had just been handed. Then the defense attorney stood. He approached the jury with a different energy, quieter, more reflective. He didn't pace. He stood still, his hands resting lightly on the jury box rail. "The prosecution just told you a story," he began. "A tragic, terrible story. But a story is not evidence. A story is not proof. And in this courtroom, proof is the only thing that matters." He paused, letting the words settle. Jeff Pelley lost his father, his stepmother, and his 2 sisters on April 29, 1989. He was 17 years old. He went to prom that night because he didn't know they were dead. He danced. He laughed. He posed for pictures. And then he came home to a nightmare. The attorney's voice softened. "The prosecution will tell you that Jeff had a motive because he argued with his father. But how many teenagers argue with their parents? How many of us, in this room right now, had conflicts with our fathers or mothers when we were 17? Does that make us murderers?" A few jurors shifted uncomfortably. "They will tell you Jeff had the opportunity because he was gone from prom for an hour. But being absent from a dance is not the same as committing murder. And they will tell you Jeff had the means because the family shotgun is missing, but they have no evidence, none, that Jeff ever touched that weapon." The attorney straightened, his tone firming. "No fingerprints, no blood, no weapon, no confession, no physical evidence of any kind. What the prosecution has is a theory, a timeline, a suspicion. But suspicion is not guilt. And in America, We do not convict people based on suspicion. He returned to his seat. The courtroom was silent. The judge looked to the prosecution. You may call your first witness. The trial had begun. The prosecution's case unfolded over the next 2 weeks. Witness after witness took the stand, each adding another piece to the narrative puzzle. A former classmate testified about Jeff's behavior at prom. He seemed normal, she said. But looking back, maybe too normal, like he was trying too hard to act like everything was fine. The defense objected. Speculation, Your Honor. Sustained, the judge replied. The jury will disregard the witness's interpretation, but the damage was done. The jury had heard it. A church elder testified about the tension he had observed between Bob and Jeff. Bob was strict, he said. He loved his son, but he didn't bend. And Jeff was pulling away. You could see it. The prosecutor leaned forward. Did you ever hear Jeff express anger toward his father? The elder hesitated. Not anger, exactly. More like frustration, like he felt trapped. Trapped, the prosecutor repeated, letting the word linger. A forensic expert testified about the timeline. Using maps, photos, and calculations, he demonstrated that Jeff could have driven from the high school to his home, committed the murders, and returned to prom within the unaccounted hour. It's tight, the expert admitted under cross-examination. But it's possible. Possible, the defense attorney echoed, but not proven. Correct. The prosecution introduced the prom photos. The jury studied them in silence. Jeff in his tuxedo, smiling beside classmates, seemingly carefree. The prosecutor argued that the photos demonstrated a chilling detachment, an ability to compartmentalize horror. The defense countered that the photos simply showed a teenager who didn't yet know his family was dead. The motive was dissected endlessly. The argument over prom, the strict household, the teenage desire for independence. The prosecution painted it as rage unleashed. The defense painted it as normal family friction. But without physical evidence, the case came down to interpretation, and interpretation could sway either way. At the midpoint of the trial, the prosecutor introduced a new angle: Jeff's behavior in the days following the murders. Witnesses testified that he had been calm, almost stoic. One relative recalled Jeff organizing funeral arrangements with unsettling efficiency. The defense objected repeatedly, arguing that grief manifests differently in everyone. The judge allowed the testimony but reminded the jury to consider context. The defense's turn came next. They called forensic experts who testified that the crime scene had been poorly preserved, that crucial evidence may have been lost or contaminated. They called character witnesses who described Jeff as a gentle, thoughtful young man incapable of violence. Teachers spoke of his academic dedication. Friends spoke of his kindness. But the most anticipated moment came when the defense attorney called Jeff Pelley to the stand. The courtroom stilled. Jeff rose, straightened his tie, and walked to the witness box. He was sworn in, his voice steady but quiet. The defense attorney began gently. Jeff, can you tell the jury what happened on April 29, 1989? Jeff took a breath. I woke up that morning like any other Saturday. My dad and I had talked about prom the night before. He said I could go, but I had to be home by midnight. I was fine with that. I got ready, my friend picked me up, and we went to the dance. Did you argue with your father that day? No, we had argued before about prom, but that morning, everything was settled. And at prom, you left for about an hour. Where did you go? Jeff hesitated. I stepped outside. I needed air. I was nervous about the whole night. The dance, the curfew, everything. I just walked around the parking lot for a while. Did you go home? No. Did you kill your family? Jeff's voice broke slightly. No. I loved them. The prosecutor's cross-examination was relentless. He focused on inconsistencies in Jeff's recollection, on the vagueness of his explanation for leaving prom, on his calm demeanor in the days after the murders. Isn't it true, Mr. Pelley, that you felt suffocated by your father's rules? I was frustrated sometimes, but I didn't hate him. Isn't it true that you wanted freedom? I was 17. Of course I wanted some independence. And isn't it true that on April 29, 1989, you decided to take that freedom by any means necessary? No, that's not true. The prosecutor leaned closer. Then explain to this jury why you can't account for that hour. Explain why you were the only person with access to the house. Explain why no one else had a motive. Jeff's attorney objected. Argumentative, sustained, but again, the question had been planted. Jeff stepped down from the stand, exhausted. The jury watched him return to his seat, their faces unreadable. Closing arguments arrived after 3 weeks of testimony. The courtroom was standing room only. The prosecutor approached the jury with confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about one thing: accountability. For 13 years, Jeff Pelley has lived free while his family has lain in graves. The defense wants you to believe that the lack of physical evidence means innocence. But ask yourselves, who else could have done this? He gestured toward the exhibits. The house was locked. No forced entry. The family shotgun is missing. And Jeff Pelley had motive, a teenager desperate for freedom. He had opportunity, an unaccounted hour during prom, and he had means access to the weapon. The prosecutor's voice rose. He killed his father because he was tired of the rules. He killed Dawn because she was a witness. And he killed 2 innocent little girls because they were there. Then he went back to prom and smiled for photos. He paused, letting the horror sink in. Justice has waited 13 years. Don't make it wait any longer. The defense attorney's closing was quieter, but no less passionate. The prosecution has built a house of cards. No weapon, blood, no fingerprints, no confession. They are asking you to convict a man based on a theory, a story they've constructed to fit their narrative. He looked each juror in the eye. But this is not a story. This is a man's life, and the burden of proof is on the state. Not maybe, not probably, beyond a reasonable doubt. He gestured toward Jeff. Jeff Pelley lost everything that night. His family, his childhood, his peace, and now the state wants to take the rest of his life based on speculation. The attorney's voice dropped. If you have doubt, any doubt, you must acquit, because in this country, we do not convict people based on suspicion. We convict them based on proof. And the proof simply isn't there. He returned to his seat. The judge instructed the jury on the law, on the meaning of reasonable doubt, on their duty to weigh evidence objectively. Then he dismissed them to deliberate. The courtroom emptied slowly. Jeff was escorted back to holding. The families retreated to separate waiting rooms. Reporters gathered outside, speculating on how long the jury would take. Hours turned into days. The jury sent notes requesting clarification on testimony, asking to review exhibits. Each note sent ripples of anxiety through both sides. On the 3rd day, the jury sent word. They had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled within minutes. Jeff was brought in, his face pale. The families took their seats, tension crackling in the air. The jury filed in, their expressions carefully neutral. The judge asked the foreperson to stand. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. On the charge of murder in the death of Robert Pelley, how do you find? Guilty. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jessie Pelley closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. On the charge of murder in the death of Dawn Pelley, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of murder in the death of Janel Pelley, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of murder in the death of Jolene Pelley, how do you find? Guilty. Jeff's face remained impassive, but his hands trembled. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. The judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. Jeff was led away in handcuffs, his future now measured in decades behind bars. Outside, the prosecutor addressed the media. Justice has been served. The Pelley family can finally rest in peace. Inside, the defense attorney filed notice of appeal. The fight, he knew, was far from over. Sentencing day arrived on a cold morning. The courtroom was somber, the air thick with finality. The judge reviewed the case file one last time. Then he looked at Jeff. Mr. Pelley, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of 4 counts of murder. Do you have anything to say before I impose sentence? Jeff stood, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't do this. I loved my family. I will never stop fighting to prove my innocence. The judge's expression remained neutral. The jury has spoken. Their verdict reflects the evidence presented, and the law as applied. You have taken 4 lives, a father, a mother, and 2 innocent children. The damage you have caused is immeasurable. He paused. On each count of murder, I sentence you to 40 years in the Indiana Department of Correction. These sentences will run consecutively. Total sentence, 160 years. The number hung in the air like a curse. 160 years, a lifetime multiplied. Jeff showed no reaction. His attorney immediately announced an appeal. The families of the victims embraced, relief and grief mingling on their faces. Jessie Pelley spoke briefly to reporters outside. This doesn't bring them back. Nothing ever will. But knowing someone is being held accountable gives me some peace. Jeff was transported to a maximum security facility that afternoon. The community of Lakeville slowly exhaled. The trial was over. The verdict had been delivered. The story, it seemed, had reached its conclusion. But stories like this never truly end. They echo. The first appeal was filed within months. Jeff's new attorney argued ineffective counsel, claiming the defense had failed to adequately challenge the prosecution's circumstantial case. The argument was meticulously crafted, citing case law and procedural missteps. The appellate court reviewed the transcripts, the evidence, and the legal arguments. After a year of deliberation, they issued their ruling, appeal denied. The court found that while the evidence was circumstantial, it had been sufficient for a jury to reach a guilty verdict. Jeff's legal team regrouped and filed again, this time focusing on the timeline. They hired independent experts, who argued that the prosecution's calculations were flawed, that the window of opportunity was narrower than presented, perhaps even impossible. The court reviewed, and again, denied. A third appeal centered on the admission of certain testimonies the witnesses who had characterized Jeff's behavior as suspicious or detached. The defense argued that these characterizations were prejudicial, that they had influenced the jury without providing factual evidence. The court's response was consistent. The trial judge had acted within his discretion. Appeal denied. With each denial, Jeff's hope dimmed slightly, though he refused to abandon the fight. Letters poured out from his prison cell to lawyers, to advocacy groups, to journalists. He told his story again and again, insisting on his innocence. Some believed him. Wrongful conviction organizations began to take notice. They reviewed the case file and saw what Jeff's defenders had always seen: a conviction built on theory rather than proof. Websites appeared. Online forums debated the evidence. Amateur sleuths dissected the timeline, searching for the flaw that would unravel the prosecution's case. But in the legal system, belief wasn't enough. New evidence was required, something concrete, something that had been missed or hidden, and despite years of searching, nothing emerged. The shotgun remained missing. No new witnesses came forward. No confessions surfaced. The case, legally speaking, was closed, but in the court of public opinion, it remained wide open. In the mid-2010s, true crime media exploded. Podcasts, documentaries, and streaming series turned cold cases into cultural phenomena. The Pelley murders, with their mixture of family tragedy, religious context, and controversial conviction, became a popular subject. The Counterclock podcast devoted an entire season to the case. The host interviewed former investigators, legal experts, and Jeff himself via prison phone calls. The podcast meticulously reconstructed the timeline, highlighting inconsistencies and raising questions about the prosecution's theory. Could Jeff really have committed 4 murders, cleaned up, and returned to prom within an hour? The host asked. The state says yes, but when we mapped it ourselves, we found the timeline impossibly tight. Listeners responded with thousands of messages. Some were convinced of Jeff's innocence, others remained certain of his guilt. The debate raged across social media, with both sides citing the same evidence to support opposite conclusions. Major networks aired specials on the case. They interviewed Jessie Pelley, who remained steadfast in her belief that justice had been served. "I remember the tension," Jessie said on camera, her voice steady. "I remember being afraid, and I remember that my brother was the only one who could have done this. The jury saw the evidence. I trust their decision." The programs also featured Jeff's interview, recorded from prison. His face had aged, lined with the years of incarceration, but his message remained unchanged. "I didn't do this," he said quietly. "I lost my family, and then I lost my freedom. I understand why people have doubt because the evidence isn't there. It never was." The documentaries polarized viewers. Online comment sections became battlegrounds. Some called for a retrial. Others insisted the conviction was sound. Legal analysts weighed in. "This is a classic circumstantial case," one explained. "The question is whether circumstantial evidence alone should be enough for a murder conviction when it carries a life sentence." Another countered, "Circumstantial evidence convicts people every day. If it's strong enough, it's valid." The jury believed it was strong enough here. The media attention reignited interest in the case, but it didn't change the legal reality. Courts don't retry cases based on public opinion. They require new evidence. And the evidence remained elusive. Wrongful conviction movements embraced Jeff's case as a symbol of systemic flaws. Advocacy groups acknowledged the troubling aspects: the lack of physical evidence, the reliance on behavioral interpretation, and the impossibly tight timeline. Fundraising campaigns emerged online. Supporters organized rallies holding signs that read, "Conviction without proof," and "Justice delayed, truth denied." But for every supporter, there was a skeptic. Victims' rights groups argued that Jeff had received a fair trial, that the jury had deliberated carefully, and that overturning the verdict would dishonor the memory of Bob, Dawn, Janel, and Jolene. Behind the scenes, Jeff's legal team continued searching for the breakthrough that would force a retrial. They requested additional forensic testing on preserved evidence, hoping that advances in technology might reveal something new. The request was granted, but the results were disappointing. No new information was found. There was nothing hidden waiting to be discovered. A private investigator revisited Lakeville, interviewing residents who had been teenagers in 1989. Most remembered little. Memories, after more than 2 decades, had faded or been reshaped by time and media coverage. Another appeal was filed, citing newly discovered evidence. Though the evidence was more reinterpretation than discovery, the court reviewed it and, once again, denied the motion. The prosecutor's office issued a brief response. "The conviction stands. Justice was served in 2006, and it remains served today. Jessie Pelley had spent most of her life navigating the dual tragedies of losing her family and seeing her brother convicted of their murders. In her 30s now, she rarely gave interviews, preferring privacy. But when she did speak, her words carried weight. In one interview, Jessie sat quietly, her hands folded. The reporter asked her directly, "Do you believe your brother is guilty?" Jessie paused. "I believe the jury saw the evidence and made their decision. I was too young to understand everything that happened that night, but I remember the fear, I remember the tension, and I trust that the people who investigated this case did their jobs." "Do you ever doubt?" "Doubt is part of grief," Jessie said softly, "but so is faith. I have faith that my family is at peace, and I have faith that justice was done." She visited her family's gravesite regularly, a quiet ritual of remembrance. The cemetery in Lakeville was small, the Pelley plot marked by a simple stone bearing 4 names. Jessie would kneel, place flowers, and whisper prayers. Sometimes other visitors would approach strangers who wanted to express sympathy or share their opinions on the case. Jessie always responded with polite distance. The case belonged to the public now, but her grief belonged to her. After each visit, she would drive past the old parsonage on Jefferson Street. It had been sold, repainted, and occupied by a new family. The house looked different now, brighter. Somehow, the shadows that had once defined it had been painted over. But Jessie knew that some shadows never fully disappear. They linger in memory, in dreams, in the quiet moments when the mind wanders back to what was lost. National media revisited the Pelley case periodically, especially around anniversaries or when new developments emerged in other cold cases. The story fit a narrative that audiences found compelling: a family destroyed, a son convicted, and a community divided. One network segment featured legal experts debating the conviction's merits. A defense attorney argued, "When you have zero physical evidence, you're asking a jury to convict based on a story. That's dangerous." A former prosecutor countered, "But sometimes stories are all we have. And if the story is strong enough, if it fits the facts tightly enough, it's valid evidence." Another program took a different angle, focusing on forensic timeline analysis. They hired independent experts to recreate Jeff's alleged route. Using modern technology and precise measurements, they calculated drive times and the estimated time to commit the murders. Their conclusion: it's theoretically possible, but it requires everything to go perfectly. No traffic delays, no unexpected complications, no hesitation. In reality, it seems highly unlikely. The prosecutor, who had tried the case, now retired, watched from his home. In an interview afterward, he stood by the conviction. The jury heard all the evidence. They deliberated for days. They reached a verdict based on the totality of circumstances. I respect their decision, and I believe justice was served. But doubt, once planted, is difficult to eradicate. The more the case was examined, the more questions emerged. And questions, in cases like this, have a way of outliving answers. Appeals continued into the 2020s. Jeff's attorneys argued claims of procedural errors, constitutional violations, and ineffective assistance of counsel. But the outcome remained consistent: denied. Frustration mounted among Jeff's supporters. How many times could a man be denied before the system acknowledged its potential error? But the legal system doesn't function on frustration, it functions on procedure. And procedurally, Jeff had received what the courts deemed a fair trial. Jeff, now in his late 40s, had spent more years in prison than he had spent free. His hair had grayed. His face had hardened, but his insistence on innocence never wavered. In letters to supporters, he wrote, "I think about my family every day. I think about what was taken from all of us. And I think about how much time has been lost. But I can't give up. Giving up would mean accepting something that isn't true." Some supporters visited him regularly. Others sent books, cards, and messages of encouragement. A few had been fighting for his release since the beginning, but the reality was undeniable. Jeff Pelley was not getting out, not unless something extraordinary happened, and extraordinary things, in the legal system, were rare. The case files became a case study in circumstantial evidence, studied by law students and forensic researchers. At one university, a criminal justice professor used the case to teach students about prosecuting without physical evidence. "This case asks a fundamental question," he told his class. "How much proof is enough, and who gets to decide?" His students debated passionately. Some argued that circumstantial evidence, when strong enough, should be sufficient. Others insisted that without physical proof, the risk of wrongful conviction was too high. "But what about the victims?" one student asked. "If we set the bar too high, don't we risk letting guilty people go free?" The professor nodded. "That's the tension. Justice for victims versus protection for the accused, and there's no perfect answer." In online forums, the Pelley case remained a perennial topic. New users would discover it, read through the evidence, and add their voices to the endless debate. The arguments repeated in cycles, never reaching resolution. Back in Lakeville, the story lived in quieter ways. Older residents remembered the day the murders were discovered. Younger residents knew it only as history. The church held annual memorial services, though attendance had dwindled over the years. Those who came did so out of habit as much as grief, a ritual that connected them to something larger. The old parsonage had changed hands again. The new owners had no idea about the house's history when they bought it. When they eventually learned, they considered selling, but ultimately stayed. "It's just a house," the husband said. "What happened here was terrible, but we can't let the past define our future." Still, some nights, when the wind rattled the windows, they would think about the family who had died there, and they would wonder what really happened on that April night. The legacy of the Pelley murders extended far beyond one family or one conviction. It became part of the larger conversation about justice, doubt, and the limits of certainty. True crime documentaries continued to feature the case, each one adding new perspectives. One podcast released an updated epilogue, reflecting on how the case had influenced discussions about wrongful convictions. "The Pelley case shows us that closure is complicated," the host said. "The family got a verdict, but did they get the truth? That's a question we may never be able to answer." The case had become a defining part of the town's identity, a story that residents carried with them, passed down through generations. The annual memorial service at the church had become a tradition, a way for the community to process its collective trauma. Each year, the current pastor would speak about healing, about moving forward, while honoring the past. "We remember Bob, Dawn, Janel, and Jolene not for how they died, but for how they lived," he would say. "They were people of faith, of love, of service, and that's the legacy we choose to carry forward." Candles would flicker in the evening light. Voices would join in hymns, and for those moments, the community would find a fragile peace. But the questions never fully disappeared. They lingered like shadows, present even in the light. Decades after the murders, the story remained unresolved in the hearts of those who lived it. Jeff maintained his innocence from behind bars. Jessie maintained her faith in the verdict. The town maintained its divided memory. And the truth, whatever it was, remained locked in the silence of that April night, buried somewhere between what was proven and what was believed, between justice delivered and certainty forever out of reach. The Pelley murders became more than a crime. They became a reflection of how we grapple with the unknowable, how we seek closure in a world that rarely offers it, and how we live with questions that have no easy answers. In the end, perhaps that was the most haunting truth of all, not that the case was solved, but that even with a conviction, with a verdict, with a sentence served, the deepest questions remained. And in a small Indiana town, where faith once promised answers, and community promised safety, those questions still echo through empty church pews and quiet streets, a reminder that some mysteries persist not because evidence is missing, but because certainty itself is an illusion we can never quite grasp.